Thank you for that very generous introduction. And yes, it is a great pleasure to be here on a campus where over many years, I, and in addition, Peter L. Berger, has hosted people, students in particular, and faculty from this campus. So it's a great pleasure to be here in person. I think I was here, we were talking earlier, I think I was here back before perhaps if some of you were even born, or at least conscious of being born, back in the 1990s. So it's been a while, and I did notice that the campus, which was always beautiful, is more beautiful and impressive than ever. So thank you, and thanks to all of you for coming tonight. I am going to be talking, yes, about two civilizational traditions that are often seen as so different that there's a failure to recognize commonalities that bridge them. And I think those commonalities have a lot, of course, to do with history and theology and doctrine. Of course, these are both Abrahamic religions. I'm speaking of Christianity and Islam. But what I'm going to be speaking about today isn't theology, per se. It has to do with the crisis of citizenship and social belonging that's impacting the carriers of these two traditions in a surprisingly similar way, and emphasis on which, recognition of which, I think can go a long way towards overcoming this view that somehow the Muslim world and the Christian world stand in some kind of antagonistic relation. They are actually both in the midst of a very, very serious challenge, and then also reinvention, not of their doctrines, not of religion, but reinvention of the way in which they respond to the complexity of the world. So I'll begin today. I think we've got the outline. I'm not going to do more than this. This is an outline of what I'm going to be talking about, and I'll just begin and apologize. I'll be talking much of my paper just to keep on track and in time. So we hear much these days of the crisis of modern citizenship and character education. Most discussions of this crisis return at some point to two vexing questions. First, what kind of character education is even feasible in the fractiously pluralized societies in which we moderns live? This, of course, is an issue in American discussions of citizenship, but it's also widespread in many other societies, including Muslim. The second question is, what conditions in society alternately might facilitate the realization of a sustainable and effective character education, and with it, our ability to reach some viable measure of agreement on the public good? I'll be focusing on that latter question today. So, as I said, these are the issues in which I'll be talking about today. I will draw on my own and other scholars' research on civic education, religion, and citizenship in modern democracies, both in the West and in non-Western, especially Muslim-majority settings. And I've done research in both over more than 3 decades. My core thesis, just to put it out front, is that some measure of consensus in both citizenship and civic education is vital for an open and effective democracy, and indeed for an open and effective religiosity. But all around the world, and not just in the West, this requirement has been made increasingly difficult by two contemporary trends, this requirement for some measure of common ethical culture. The first trend is the growing ethico-religious plurality found in late modern societies, and more serious yet, and secondly, the rise of new social media that, rather than bridging divides through the construction of an overlapping consensus, algorithmize and segmentarize social difference for the purpose of commercial and political gain. That's a core argument that I'll be trying to expand on today. I will suggest that although these trends make achieving an operating consensus on citizenship and our public ethical priorities more challenging, they also make it clear just what must be done to respond to this dilemma, not least of all by people of religious commitment and faith. Our present predicament. Several years ago, in a chapter published in a volume on citizenship and toleration, the well-known Canadian philosopher and ethicist, he's also a Catholic, Charles Taylor, observed, quote, "Our present predicament is for the most part rather different than the one which generated the traditions of political community and ethical solidarity once central to citizenship in Western societies. Something's changed, he's saying. What he meant by this statement is that whereas in an earlier age, political belonging in the United States and the West as a whole was, quote, defined and justified in cosmic religious terms, and he means primarily Christian. Today, Western societies have become so culturally diverse as to make any such shared political cosmology impossible. That's his argument. In these unsettled circumstances, and then I quote him again, contemporary democracies, as they progressively diversify, will have to undergo redefinitions of their historical identities, which may be far-reaching and painful. In other words, the loss of that common cosmology, a Judeo-Christian cosmology, is going to be painful. If this diagnosis is true, if Taylor's diagnosis is true, and I believe it is, how then are we to reach agreement on critical matters like citizenship and social justice, requirements for a democracy? Taylor's answer to this question is sociologically underspecified, but nonetheless, I feel it's a good beginning. Rather than building on a shared Judeo-Christian or other deep religious cosmology, Taylor says, and I quote him here, "We are condemned to live an overlapping consensus," end quote. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with that term, Taylor's reference to an overlapping consensus invokes, of course, the American liberal political philosopher John Rawls and his ideas on how justice can be realized in liberal societies, and he means liberal in the philosophical sense, not the liberal versus conservative sense. To his great credit, to Rawls' great credit, Rawls' hugely influential account breaks with the rational choice theory that is so pervasive in political theory today, political and economic theory today, to emphasize that modern citizens are not just utility-seeking monads, but require a common set of values to live together in a complex, plural society. However, like Taylor, Rawls went on to observe that in light of the ethical and religious plurality that characterizes modern democracies and modern societies, including the United States, we can no longer assume that this overlapping consensus can build on a shared ethical tradition, like the one, again, provided by religion or some other, to use Rawls' phrase, comprehensive doctrine. We're not going to be able to look to religion or a shared comprehensive doctrine. So again, it's a very, very concerning prognosis, and that's again what I'm focused on. Rawls goes on. Where they reach agreement at all, each citizen will do so by subscribing to some core concept of justice internal to or otherwise grounded on his or her own core values, rather than, again, some kind of shared religious ethic. But we can ask, and I will ask tonight, if modern plurality renders our subscription to democratic values dependent on personal constructs rather than shared comprehensive doctrines, like shared religious traditions, are not the public subscription and thus democracy themselves in jeopardy? Isn't this what Taylor, after all, is so clearly worrying about when he says, to quote him again, that under conditions of modern plurality, the requisite redefinitions of historical identities, he means our identities, may be far-reaching and painful. And he leaves it there. He leaves it there. I agree with this basic premise. So now Rawls and Taylor. I agree with this basic premise of both Rawls and Taylor's account, but I fear both don't dig deep enough into the sociological sources of our late modern moral and ethical predicament. As a result, the remedies they suggest are, I feel, incomplete. To explain what I mean here, let me turn for a moment to another historical dimension of religion and citizenship in Western liberal societies, again in the philosophical liberal sense of the term, one that does not figure in either Rawls or Taylor's account of our contemporary predicament. It's my account of our contemporary predicament. My hope is that this discussion may provide us with additional clues as to the depth of our modern pluralist plight and what, if anything, may be done to overcome it. Now, the issue to which I'm referring is one raised in several recent studies of Christianity's role in the creation and socialization of citizen ethics in modern liberal democracies. Christianity's role. It has long been argued by authors as diverse as Taylor and the quasi-Marxist theorist Talal al-Assad that Christianity provided the cultural foundation for many modern Western ideals of citizenship and democracy. That's what Rawls and Taylor were referring to. Christianity was central to modern ideals of citizenship and democracy. I agree wholeheartedly. Indeed, the premise of my discussion tonight is one of total agreement with this observation on the centrality of Christian values in the shaping of liberal and democratic values. Left there, however, I also feel that the conclusion overlooks, here's where things get rough, the Janus-faced nature of Christian cultures, or any religious cultures, in modern politics. Here's where an example of what I am referring to is highlighted in an article written by the Israeli-based but American-born political scientist Jonathan Fox, an IR scholar whom I happen to know and respect greatly. In this latter essay, Fox reviews a broad range of facts on state-society religion relations in Christian majority democracies in Western Europe, Latin America, and Eastern Europe. There's 40 in his sample, Christian majority democracies. Fox points out that about 30 of the 40 countries that meet his criteria for being Christian majority developed their democracies under circumstances where religious freedoms were not extended to all religious communities in each of these societies. As I said, it's a little rough. On the contrary, in fact, Fox shows that 40% of these Christian majority societies, this includes Western Europe, Western Europe does not at all depart from the Christian majority pattern seen in Eastern Europe or Latin America or the Americas generally. In 40% of these Christian majority societies, the state officially recognized and favored just one Christian church, not all Christian churches, and not non-Christian churches. In another 30%, the state favored several denominations, typically Christian, think Germany, think Belgium, but it did not extend recognition or services to non-Christian religious traditions. So 70% of Christian majority societies didn't extend religious freedom. And we're speaking up to the beginning of the new millennium to non-Christian and otherwise minority faith traditions. Other facts make this, and I think we can call it this discriminatory effect all the clearer. You'll see where I'm going with this. I'm not trying to criticize Christianity. I'm trying to show how religion can and must be brought back in religion and ethics. Other facts make this discriminatory effect in Fox's data set all the more interesting. In 87.5% of Fox's Christian democratic sample, course instruction in Christianity is offered in public schools. However, only a tiny minority of Christian democracies provide the same option for religious instruction to non-Christian students, even where, as in France today, a large portion of the population professes or observes a non-Christian religion. They aren't given the same treatment, the same opportunity. This reality of a differentiated rather than equal citizenship is also seen in the widespread restrictions seen in these same Christian majority societies on minority groups' freedom to build places of worship, bring in foreign clergy, or otherwise enjoy a freedom of religion on par with that of their Christian co-citizens. Fox's conclusion, sticking with him, is simple and clear, and I quote, "Religious discrimination is ubiquitous in Christian democracies." What's going on? You heard me say earlier, Christianity provided much of the substance for the sweetest, the purest, the most important of values for modern democracies and citizenship. But somehow the delivery with regard to full citizens in complex plural societies has not quite been consistent with that ideal. Let me go on. In his 2009 History of Secularism and Society in Modern France, Turkey, and the United States, the San Diego-based political scientist Ahmet Kuru, who happens to be a friend of mine, shed a similar light on what I'm calling here tonight the Janus-faced influence of religious institutions and Christian socialization. This time with regard to, and again, Protestantism and democracy in the 19th century United States. Kourou celebrates, as I do, the argument presented almost 2 centuries ago by the renowned French writer Alexis de Tocqueville that at the dawn of the American Republic, congregational life, and that meant primarily Protestant life, was one of the first institutions of American democracy. It was. De Tocqueville showed, and I agree, that it was congregational worship, it was in congregational worship and assembly that small-town Americans learned what he called the habits of the heart, required for self-government and a broadly participatory citizenship. Here again we see the bright side, Janus-faced, the bright side of Christianity's Janus-faced influence on democracy, the bright side. But Kourou goes on. Drawing on many historical and sociological studies, Kourou then reminds us that there was a dark side to this Janus face as well. Drawing on a rich assortment of historical studies, Kourou shows that in the 19th century, some Americans drew on these same congregational legacies to make a less inclusive claim on American public life. In the aftermath of something all of you will, I think in this room, will be familiar with, that is, in the aftermath of what has come to be known, not everybody likes the phrase, the Second Great Awakening of the 1820s and 1830s, growing numbers of evangelical Americans invoked their Christian identity, not just to be more observant, but to argue that citizens who were non-Protestant and non-white were in fact not full and equal American citizens. There's the harshness again. Notwithstanding the First Amendment's clauses on the separation of church and state, and I quote Kourou, Protestant quasi-establishment became the norm in American civil religion from the early 1800s onward. In keeping with this trend, a King James Bible-based variety of Protestantism was mandated in public schools curricula with the express aim of, quote, acculturating students with non-denominational Protestantism. More generally, Kourou shows the public schools curricula were rife with material that Catholic and Jews found offensive because much of it was directed against Catholics and Jews. As the Catholic proportion of the population swelled in the United States from, anybody know what it was in 1780? 35,000. To about 3 million in 1860, anti-Catholic and anti-Semitic nativism didn't go down, it surged. When Catholics responded to the Protestant bias in public schools curricula by appealing for state funding for their own schools, as many of you probably know, majoritarian nativists replied by pressing for a constitutional amendment banning funding to sectarian schools. Therein began the pattern of more pronounced separation of religion and state in education with which we're now familiar. Meanwhile, beyond the halls of state, the nativist surge took an even more worrying turn as an epidemic of violence was unleashed by white nationalist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Much of this discrimination would, of course, pass. Between 1880 and 1920, the Catholic population grew to more than 17 million people out of a total of 92 million. America was changing. But nonetheless, discrimination and violence remained widespread, now often targeting African Americans and non-Christian minorities more than Catholics. By my reading, to move forward now, the Janus face, none of Kourou and Fox's reminders of the potentially uncivil side of religion's Janus-faced character socialization detract from the fact that the key features of Christianity in America and the modern West underlay many of the best values, best ideals of modern citizenship and democracy. In particular, Christian ethical culture provided theological grounds for the affirmation of a universal human dignity, a notion at the heart of our modern notion of human rights. I don't think it would have been possible without that Christian legacy. This has long been Taylor's viewpoint on the centrality of Christian values and the shaping of modern democracy and modern citizenship, and I agree with it. But again, the American example also reminds us that religion as a socio-political reality can shape public ethics in a Janus-faced way, sometimes exclusively rather than inclusively. To state the matter in somewhat more turgid theoretical terms, Christian valuation may veer in an equality-denying and discriminatory direction where core Christian concepts regarding universal human dignity and equality are put aside in favor of a crude identity politics that promotes a citizenship differentiated along religious, racial, or gender lines. I'm moving forward, you may sense. The fact that such discrimination can occur is not the result of some intrinsic flaw in Christian theology. It was and is today the product of political entrepreneurs mobilizing popular Christian identities in such a way as to override the deeper life and dignity affirming message of the Christian gospel. Political instrumentalization trumps theological depth, and it does in other faith traditions as well, as you'll hear me say later. In a recent study, it's actually back to 2016, the African-American sociologist Gene Beeman has provided us with a vivid analysis of a related but more contemporary instrumentalization and sectarianization of Christian identities, put that in quotes, this time, of course, in France. As we are all perhaps well aware, not least of all if you've been following the election campaign of the last few weeks, in France since the 1990s, far-right nativists, most of them previously indifferent to or contemptuous of Christian and Catholic traditions, have learned to play a racialized and, pseudo-Catholic identity politics. They have underscored France's history as a Catholic nation, not to affirm some deeper Christian message, a message of a beloved community, for example, if I can use MLK's phrase. Not that message, but to press for a differentiated citizenship that excludes Muslims and racial minorities on the grounds that a true French person, is Catholic and white. We all know that in recent years a similar populist mobilization of Christian and racial identities has featured in far-right political discourses in countries as varied as Hungary, Russia, and yes, certain circles in the United States. Now let me pause and go a bit further afield with my examples, however, so as to make clear that the Janus-faced nature of religion that I'm talking about here is not something peculiar to Christianity alone. In fact, it doesn't primarily have anything to do with Christianity in any deep theological, substantive value sense. It has to do with politics and the instrumentalization, the crude instrumentalization of religion and the way in which that can hollow out the best of Christian values. In India, my example, the world's largest democracy, the rise of the majoritarian and xenophobic movement known as Hindutva, or Hindu nationalism, has been the single most dramatic development in that huge democracy since the 1990s. It's the movement that's in power now. And rather than moderating, it's become more extreme and exclusivist. The Hindutva phenomena was not the result of a conservative Hindu movement mobilizing against electoral democracy. On the contrary, as the anthropologist Thomas Blom-Hansen has noted, quote, the movement has grown and come to power largely by obeying the procedures of parliamentary democracy, indeed brilliantly. In other words, Hindutva activists have played the religious and politics game in a darkly, again my phrase, Janus-faced manner, stigmatizing Muslims, attacking Christian missionaries, sometimes killing them, and otherwise marginalizing those who depart from the majoritarian Hindu profile as presented by Hindutva. My point here, of course, is that the Hindutva example speaks to a public ethical phenomenon widespread in late modern democracies. Many of us thought we were beyond this some years ago. We're not. In many societies, nativist politicians have learned to abide by the procedural norms of electoral democracy. They do so often in a combination with a skillful use of social media, a new instrument. a new instrument of sectarianization and instrumentalization. Media which are, again, algorithmically, calibrated to message in a segmentary and exclusive rather than inclusive way. Social media have made this challenge greater and worse. These political entrepreneurs disseminate their social messaging then, not for the purpose of socializing a more inclusive variety of what some years ago I called democratic civility, with its trademark affirmations of liberty, equality, and solidarity and dignity and difference. They aim instead to redirect religious identities toward the socialization of a public culture that is majoritarian, exclusivist, and illiberal with regard to the rights and identities of social minorities. Ethical prioritization and civic education. So what lessons can we learn from these rather sad examples, at least in my view, of the Janus-faced capacity for religion as a human reality to be put to exclusive rather than inclusive public ends? Value affirming, dignity affirming ends. At its most basic and positive level, this example reminds us that late modern societies and polities are not just or even primarily assemblies of free and equal individuals making rational choices on the basis of values and preferences of their own making alone. This is a reference to those of you who are familiar with rational choice theory. This may not be familiar to many of you. As the Harvard ethical philosopher Michael Sandel has tirelessly argued for more than a generation, actors in all societies are not rational choice monads, but are encumbered by in the good sense, encumbered by the attachments and identifications constitutive of their social being. The ethical question at the heart of any society's encumbrances then builds on this fact and ultimately concerns just which encumbrances within a tradition, Christian, Hindu, or whatever, are to be prioritized and which are not. That's my core message tonight. Value prioritization. The examples I have featured in my remarks today also underscore that the social encumbrances and solidarities latent in one social field, like congregational Christianity in 19th century America, with all of its beauty and positive contribution, can at times be repurposed by political entrepreneurs in another field, a political field. When this is done in a manner that shifts the religious values away from the affirmation of universal human dignity and shared citizen belonging instead into a we versus they identity politics, the ethical socialization operative in one domain may be put to ends antithetical to the values embraced by some adherents of those same religious traditions. Christian values are hollowed out and replaced with identity politics. Processes like these, involving the capture and repurposing of one religious and societal assemblage by another, of course, have long featured in sociological discussions of the modern public sphere, such as that of the German sociologist Jürgen Habermas and his analysis of capitalism and the state. My sense, however, this is for those of you who read sociology, my apologies if you don't, if the reference is unfamiliar. My sense, however, is that comparative analysis from around the world indicates that contests for hegemony and instrumentalization of this sort are even more pervasive and damaging than Habermas's, somewhat Marxist sociological model implies. He says it's really primarily about class and control of economic resources. As my discussion of modern democracies, be it America or Hindutva India, the culture wars raging in many parts of the world really have as much or even more to do with questions of national identity, human dignity, and citizen belonging than they do material interests or governance in any narrow sense of the term. What then is to be done? It is in circumstances like these of the weaponization and instrumentalization of religion and its disastrous, in my view, impact on religious values, deeper religious values. It is in circumstances like these that the role of religious leaders, educators, and other proponents of the values of democratic civility become all the more urgent and also clearer, the path forward. In other words, it turns out that contrary to a certain materialist mythology that's widespread in modern market societies, and it is widespread, ethical culture and character education have come to figure in national politics and national debates around the world, not just in the United States. They've come to figure now more than ever. We're back in the age of ethical contestation, and that's a good thing. For people of religious persuasion, and I'm referring to, of course, deep religious persuasion, the task in such circumstances has become clear. Perhaps I can say, we must do all that we can do to protect the relative autonomy of the religious and educational fields, including those Christians, so as to prevent their capture and repurposing by identity politics entrepreneurs. The defense of just such spheres of independent socialization and value education are vitally necessary if democracy is to survive and to avoid the veering towards a majoritarian, populist abuse of religion. Now, in other words, the struggle, the public ethical struggle that I'm referring to here is about which values within Christianity, within Hinduism, within liberalism, whatever, which values are to be prioritized now, which are most urgent, and how can we prioritize them in an effective way. If I'm not mistaken, it's this argument over value prioritization. Which Christian values really are the most important? Which Muslim values, I'll have more on this in a moment, are really most important? It's this debate over ethical prioritization that Charles Taylor had in mind when he warned against what he called, his term, the fetishization of certain civic practices, like, he argued, and I agree, the banning of headscarves from French schools on the grounds that these violate French Republican principles. Taylor rightly counsels us that now more than ever, citizens in Western societies, including France and the United States, need to think long and hard about their democratic, ethical, and religious priorities, and what social and institutional measures most effectively realize those aims. Taylor also emphasizes the importance of developing public policies and institutions whose purpose or reference points can serve as a true bulwark of freedom and or the locus of national cultural expression. Although Taylor makes his remarks from what is, or within what is largely a secular liberal framework, although he himself is a practicing Catholic, the task of ethical definition and prioritization to which he invites modern Western Democrats to participate is one that was perhaps best exemplified in a modern American setting by the late Martin Luther King, with his ideal of the beloved community. Martin Luther King's example reminds us that citizenship as a sociocultural reality, which is what I'm talking about here, is never just a matter of, as the theorist of citizenship decades ago put it, T.H. Marshall, it's never just a matter of a status accorded to full members of a community, equal with respect to the rights and duties with which the status endowed. Citizenship is not that simple. Other social realities, including those shaped by ethnicity, race, gender, class, and the instrumentalization of religious identities and values, can carry over and disrupt a proper, inclusive, and egalitarian practice of citizenship. Let me move to my last section here before the conclusion, which has to do with Islam. Because thus far I've made a reference to Hindutva, India, but I haven't said much, as I promised I would, about Islam. And again, some people, some of you perhaps, if you're not familiar with the Muslim world, may think that the kinds of issues that I've been talking about really are peculiar to Christian majority and or quote-unquote Western liberal societies. But in fact, they lie at the heart of the culture contest that is raging across the Muslim world today. I'm going to illustrate this by way of a society, a Muslim majority society, in which I have worked for more than the last 30 years. That's Indonesia, the world's most populous Muslim majority society and also the third largest democracy in the world. Now, Indonesia underwent a great return to democracy in 1998, 1999, after 30 years of authoritarian rule. One of the ironies of this very hopeful, the Arab Spring did not leave us with many effective democracies. Indonesia has its problems, but it survived. Now, but one of the ironies of the new democratic freedoms that the return to democracy allowed was that the country soon witnessed the proliferation of hundreds of Islamist vigilante groups determined to push back, sometimes violently, against Christians, who are 10% of Indonesia's population, liberal Muslims, gender egalitarians, particularly Muslim ones, and others deemed deviant from the Islamist vigilante understanding of Islam, of Muslim norms. For Muslim populist and exclusivist Islamists, if I can use that phrase, in hardline groups like the Islamic Defenders Front, these actions were justified by claims that the core challenge, here's the prioritization, the core challenge facing Muslims was the threat posed by neo-imperial Western powers invading Muslim lands, including Indonesia, through now not direct colonization or warfare, but through cultural, economic, and lifestyle media. The internet was the new weapon of Western cultural imperialism. The only way to combat this threat, the Islamists argue, the hardline Islamists, is to rally the public to a unitary and Muslim supremacist understanding of Sharia law and citizen belonging, not citizen equality, but Muslim supremacism. By contrast, for the Muslim democratic intellectuals and leaders in Indonesia, among whom I've also worked for more than 30 years, this same political turbulence affecting politics and citizenships in Indonesia was seen as evidence not of the need to build barricades against an invading West, but of an entirely different ethical priority. It was evidence of the need for Muslim scholars and politicians to work harder to convince the Muslim public that, yes, Islamic values are vital for modern democracy, but contrary to the radical Islamist claim, the values that are most relevant, here's the prioritization, for today are those that carry over democratic and inclusive values into the very heart of Muslim ethical and political life. To build and defend such an inclusive and democratic public ethics, the Muslim Democrats explains, requires a reformed understanding of God's guidance and laws, a reformed understanding of Sharia, or Islamic law, an understanding that builds on not the idea that the Sharia is unchanging and fixed, and least of all has primarily to do with certain draconian punishments for things such as blasphemy or adultery, but has to do with what is called in Islamic ethical and legal theory the maqasid, that is, the higher aims of Islamic law. Not the punishments, Islamic law's higher aims. There's that same struggle over ethical prioritization that we see in the West, raging in the Muslim world. These concerns with what I'll call, borrowing the term from my Muslim friends, maqasidization, prioritization in terms of higher aims, are an important part. In fact, they're the core part of the struggle for the heart and soul of Muslim politics and ethics raging around the world today. Now, the term maqasid, bear with me for just a couple of minutes, has a deep history. It became a concern. Sharia, Islam is a religion of law, among other things, as is Judaism, and indeed to a far greater degree than is the case with Christianity, which has relied much more heavily on a kind of division of labor between first the Roman state and then later states to work out the precise nature of law. But Islam, like Judaism, has a much more expansive understanding of law. And some Islamists understand it in a fixed and rather fiercely draconian way, but others, and this has been the ascendant current since the late 19th and early 20th century, say, no. That's not the priority. The priority is recognizing the higher aims of God's law. Well, what are those higher aims? As the Toronto-based scholar of Islamic law and a friend, Anwar Iman, has noted, there has been a lamentable tendency in many studies of Islamic legal theory and ethical debates to assume that the maqasid really have to do with very technical, again, and does get technical, very technical arguments among jurisconsults, the scholars of the law in Islam. But what you've heard me saying here today is that, in fact, a broad portion of the Muslim community, and certainly Muslim intellectuals, believes that the case is quite the contrary. That the maqasid, really, discussion of the maqasid is important so as to emphasize that the values that must be given a kind of priority are those that affirm human dignity, a universal human dignity, a fundamental creatural equality, and yes, rights of equal and equitable participation. Again, bear with me here. Originally formulated by, among others, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who died in 1111, and Abu Ishaq al-Shatibi, who died in 1388, this discourse on the maqasid, the higher aims of Sharia, was developed because Muslim scholars themselves needed an instrument in a religion of law to move beyond the idea that the law was something fixed and finished, and above all, something that had to do with what it was often identified with by state authorities, certain draconian punishments, again, for adultery, theft, and things like that. In its classical formulation, the maqasid methodology, however, affirmed that Islamic law on most matters is not a matter of fixed and finished rules. So this discussion began almost 1,000 years ago, but that it has to do with the preservation of 5 fundamental aims. So these scholars stood back, and these are not minor scholars. Ghazali is arguably the greatest Muslim scholar. He was also a Sufi. The greatest Muslim scholar to emerge after the classical age, again, dying in 1111. His influence across the Muslim world is still powerful and pervasive to this day. So he was the one who formulated this idea that the core aims of the Sharia are not those draconian punishments, but have to do with preservation of the 5 essentials, or ethical priorities, prioritization again. That is, the preservation of life, the preservation of religion and morality, the preservation of rationality, don't get drunk, don't drink, don't take drugs, the preservation of rationality and knowledge, the preservation of property, and finally, and not least of all, the preservation of family and progeny. That's what must be prioritized, Ghazali said, and many Muslim scholars today say, if Islamic law is going to make an effective and ethical contribution to society. Today, I would add, moving forward now to debates about the maqasid and ethical prioritization in Islam today, many Muslim Democrats are convinced, those with whom I work, that these ethical values include not just these 5 priorities, though they build on those. They say, yeah, those are the key, but those have to be extended to include the values of justice, universal human dignity. They say, well, those are implicit there, but now we have to link them to concepts of citizenship. Equal justice, universal human dignity, and some would say individual freedoms, and yes, gender equality. That is not a stretch and not an unfamiliar argument in large portions of the Muslim world. Today, in this regard, the appeals of these Muslim Democrats for Muslims to get their values right, ethical prioritization, bears a striking resemblance to the observation of the gentleman with whom I started, that is Charles Taylor, and others, when they have, as I said earlier, they've criticized the fetishization of European values. Taylor did this. The fetishization that Taylor had in mind is seen when, as he has said in many fora, when in the name of defending Europe and Christian civilization, Europeans in places like France banned the Muslim headscarf. Or, my favorite, and it still shocks me, arrest women on beaches in the Riviera for wearing the burkini in encompassing and modest, and I might say, I think, very admirable and familiar if you know a little bit about Western bathing habits. But women have been arrested, Muslim women have been arrested on the Riviera beaches for wearing this modest dress while swimming. So French defenders of Western civilization have confused this, what Taylor calls fetishization of French values, French identity, with a true commitment to the values of equality, freedom, and recognition with indifference. There's the prioritization. My last conclusion here. What conclusion can we draw from these varied developments in the Muslim and Western worlds? Varied, but I've tried to suggest tonight, astonishingly similar. What I've tried to show this evening, then, is that whether in the Muslim majority world or the late Christian, or some would say, post-Christian West, I don't say, struggles over how to interpret religious and ethical traditions and what to prioritize in doing so are an overlooked but deeply important part of democracy and citizenship and politics today. In fact, I think they're at the heart of the debates raging in our societies. Contrary to the materialist mythologies so pervasive in our age, values and debates over value prioritization now more than ever figure in the polities of all late modern nations as a result of the growing religious and ethnic plurality of societies around the world. This same task of ethical deliberation and prioritization is made all the more urgent in an age of Twitter rage and social mediated instrumentalization of religious identity. It's made all the more urgent when even high offices, and I'm not talking about the United States, I'm talking about everywhere. I'm talking about France, I'm talking about India. It's pervasive. This task of getting our values right is made all the more urgent when even high offices at the very heart of our democracies are threatened with capture by political entrepreneurs of illiberal exclusion, sometimes claiming to act and exclude in the name of religious identity and tradition. In such an age of religiously leveraged identity politics, it becomes all the more imperative for democratic-minded people of faith to work from within their traditions, to make clear, to make sure that they get, and we get, the higher aims, our maqasid, of our own ethico-religious traditions right. That's our challenge. We get it right, I believe, when we invoke our religious values to work to build an overlapping consensus that prioritizes freedom, dignity, inequality, and solidarity across social difference, rather than the exclusion of those who don't look like us or come from a different faith tradition. Again, the task of building such an overlapping consensus will not be easy in an age of algorithmically driven social media instrumentalization and segregation. But it is one made all the more urgent by the fact that our societies, our democracies, and for some believers among us, our very faith are as what is at stake. Faced with the abuse of Islam by groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, my Muslim democratic friends in Indonesia, Turkey, and elsewhere understand this well. In fact, it's astonishing how keenly aware Muslim Democrats are of the threat posed to their tradition, not just politically, but religiously, by this instrumentalization. It's time that we in America and other Western democracies recognize this fact as well, and recognize the depth and commonality of our modern moral plight with Muslims, Hindus, and others around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing with us. So we'll have some time for questions now. And I think You're gonna
stay here?
You're gonna stay here.
Okay.
So we'll come around with some mics, and if you have a question, you can raise your hand, please, and we'll let Dr. Hefner run the show here.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you.
Oh, they're here. Sorry. I'll go to Ian. Oh, here's a closer one. All right. I'll get you next.
First of all, thank you so much for the lecture. I didn't know pretty much any of that, so thank you.
Thank you.
And from what I think I got is both within the Christian community and the Muslim community, there's this struggle of prioritization of core values and how that's presented, which I see as, oh, this could be potentially like a bridging dialogue between these communities. So do you have any advice for how we can go about those conversations with the Christian community and the Muslim community in a respectful way and engage in that dialogue in a constructive manner?
It's happening. It's a great question. It's happening, and it's happening because it's happening, I should say, where people from both communities are aware of the scale of the challenge they face. And that's not something you need an academic to counsel on. If you travel to places like Turkey, Morocco, Indonesia, or if you travel and work with Protestants, Catholics in places like France, those who are of democratic persuasion, they are keenly aware that there is a grave threat to both citizenship, but also to their own religious traditions. The term that I use, I've spent a lot of time in France. I became an anthropologist and international relations person, primarily because I did a junior year abroad in France when I was a lot younger. But I became a French speaker, and I am someone who benefited enormously from that experience in France, and I have great respect for France. But it is in France that when one speaks with Catholics in particular, that there's a keen awareness of how much damage is being done to Catholicism as well as citizenship, to Catholicism by those like Marine Le Pen, and she's actually now the more moderate among those who are mobilizing in the name of a kind of Catholic identity politics, the damage that's being done to Catholic traditions, because it's a bait and switch. You shift core Christian values, core Catholic values. You shift and you replace them with simple identity politics. People in the Muslim community are keenly aware of this as well. ISIS, I'm not exaggerating this. I'm talking also about moderately conservative Muslims. Moderately conservative Muslims watched the ISIS phenomenon and were astonished and shocked and hurt and realized that they had not been sufficiently preemptive and anticipatory. So it's the reality of the world. So that's my answer is actually, it sounds dire, but it is to say that actually the kind of political contestation over the very meaning and values to be prioritized within each of these faith traditions, that's what's driving a recognition and dialogue, and it is taking place. It's not taking place enough. When you live in the United States, Muslims are 2% of the population, and I know from working with my students who are not Muslim, those who are not Muslim, that many people just grow up and don't have an experience of actually knowing what an American Muslim is like. When you work in the community, as I have, you realize, these are, they have been hurt, damaged, and shocked by extremism, most of which is outside of the United States. Keep in mind, the mainstream Muslim community in the United States is Muslim Democrat, good citizens, good Americans, no exaggeration there. But they recognize the scale of the threat. So it's politics, it's the very pervasiveness of this instrumentalization that makes Christian leaders and Muslim leaders and others aware of the challenge they jointly face and the need for exactly the kind of dialogue and collaboration of which you speak.
Thank you so much.
So I had a question about you talked a lot about how they weaponize beliefs or even like misconstrue beliefs. So what do you think a method for preventing that is? Is it like a lack of education, or do you think people are just, it's easy to bring out the negative side effects maybe of a lot of religions, of how it's easy to like alienate or just make the other side look like the enemy, like with Christianity, for instance, being such like a communal, you talk about community a lot in Protestantism, how community can, once you alienate someone, it's very easy to turn them into kind of like we can exclude them. So how do you prevent that? Is it people being better educated about the positive ethics of the religion and morality, or do you think that it's just, you talked a lot about technology, but that's a very difficult one to get into.
Well, it's a great challenge for the technological and in particular the social media reason. The landscape, in political theory, we talk about the public sphere. And there was this somewhat too romantic, but still important characterization of the public sphere as a place, an arena, where people in a democratic society, but who hold different values, come together and kind of work out, again, an operating consensus, to use Rawls' term. And that's, even though, it usually is a little bit more complicated than that, and there's some politics and some exclusions that take place, nonetheless, that is a critical part of how to work out a sense of who we are and the values we wish to prioritize, not as a religious community in this instance, but as a political community, a democracy. And now comes the dark part, the Janus part. The public sphere has shifted in a very profound way because large numbers of people no longer, I think of my son, who's in the Army, and he had no interest in my kind of romantic public sphere and kind of, educating yourself and going out. My son he rebelled against his academic parents. But he was representative, so he was always on social media. He was always in a segmented world. He was always in an environment where not only was he not sort of engaging in dialogue with others to work out a sense of who we are and what we share, but that just wasn't of concern for him. I'm sorry, Will. I shouldn't single him out in this way. But my point is that the challenge is severe. Social media are part of, and they're a major part of what has changed this critical locus of democracy and living together in any society. And it's not just in the West. In India, I mentioned Hindutva. We have people here who know better than I and who publish on, works by articles by people who work in places like in India. In India, social media have been weaponized against Muslims and Christians by, again, not the Hindu majority, but by these Hindutva activists. So that, some of the awful examples include they've instrumentalized Muslim eating of beef. So that when Muslims, don't come in and slaughter a Hindu, but if a cow dies, they'll be the ones who come in, typically at the request of, somebody from the neighborhood and say, you can take the cow and eat it. We're not going to eat it. We're Hindus. But Hindus, militants, recognizing that here's an opportunity to harden that divide between them and us. Muslims represent about 15% of the population in India. So they're not a large percentage, but that's still about 160 million people. And so that somebody calls and says, there's a guy who just picked up a cow, here's his license plate number, hunt him down, capture him, take care of him. So there have been many instances of Muslim butchers, in the ordinary sense that they're doing a service that they've always done, being singled out and killed by Hindutva, and it's only possible with the use of social media. And you're like, well, okay, those are sort of isolated incidents. No. The point is, it's those incidents that then get broadcast across the nation. And you'd think, oh, well, then everybody would recoil with horror. Wouldn't this sort of be counterproductive to the exclusivist Hindutva message? And it appears that it's not. It's like this attack, Putin's ability to control social media and propaganda in Russia, and his numbers have not only not fallen, they've increased since he's moved into Ukraine, because he's been able to shape the message. We're not talking about an open and equitable public sphere. So the answer to your question, it's a great question. I've answered in a kind of worrisome way. We do face a new kind of world because democracy and living together depends upon, we got to talk with each other, we got to communicate with each other. Something like, again, to use the democratic theory term, a public sphere. And social media have changed the public sphere. I'll get just another quick example, very quick. In Burma, Myanmar, as you probably know, the Rohingya have been driven out, 900,000 of them. Probably 100,000 were killed, and that was rape, pillaging of, and that was, again, only possible through a sustained online media campaign. Everybody in places like Burma, you think, wait, they're walking around with phones? They don't have computers. They're walking around with phones reading social media? And the simple answer to that is absolutely yes. And the social media that they read is not that of a shared public sphere where we work together hard to kind of resolve our differences and build some kind of common platform. The social media they read is one that says, oh, those Muslim Rohingya, you know what they're trying to do? They're trying to marry our women. They're trying to take over our country, which there's such a small minority that it's not, but social media can have that effect. So we face a very, very serious challenge. The shorter answer to your question is, this is why it's all the more important, as I said, for people who have other platforms, religious leaders. Secular leaders, too, but religious leaders of the deeper values, the deeper prioritization, they have a platform that extends a little bit beyond the social media base. That's why religion and that's one among many reasons why religion and religious leaders matter. That's why they're so critical to responding, to rising to the challenge of identity politics raging in many countries, including the United States. So there's a kind of dire diagnosis, but there's also a message like, boom, contrary again to those materialist mythologies that I referred to. Guess what? Religion and ethics and kind of people speaking out matters now more than ever. The struggle over ethical prioritization.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. I think we have time for, just one more question. And I see your hand. I'm sorry. I saw this one first, and then I'm sure Professor Hefner will take a few questions if we want to come down and introduce ourselves to him. Oh, I'll let a student. Yes, good point. Sorry. No, it's good. Okay, yes, thank you.
You talked about Catholic Christianity and how it's affecting, but what about Orthodox Christianity leaders?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I was looking up here. So could you just repeat the question? What about Orthodox?
Yes.
You mean what's my...
Orthodox Christianity leaders, what have they done towards us?
You mean in terms of the kind of problems that I'm talking about here?
Yes.
Well, it depends. The Orthodox Christian community in the United States has, I think, been a little hesitant in an interesting way to join in the identity politics bandwagon. I don't want to overgeneralize, it's a complicated community. But they've been a little less hesitant to join that bandwagon because they recognize they have, at times in American history, been portrayed as kind of outsiders. They're not part of that big, Protestant mainstream. And again, I don't mean that. But so they're keenly aware of this. When we go to Russia, the Orthodox community there, I'm sorry to say, I don't think the Orthodox community there faces a huge difficulty. Russia is, as we have been made well aware. I traveled to Russia, and I might say several times in the early 2000s. My last trip, I think, was about 2012. And there was still this was to meet with religious leaders. And we were talking about religion around the world, but it was, since 80% of the participants in this rather small conference were from the Russian Federation. We were really talking, we were using examples from around the world, but we were really talking about Christian orthodoxy in the role it could and should play in Russia. And to my surprise, no, I shouldn't say, to my surprise, there was great optimism in the room from many of and these were some very high-ranking, but not the highest-ranking representatives of the Russian Orthodox Church. And there was a sense that Russia was changing, that religion was becoming a part of national political life in a good sense. A sense similar to what I was underscoring here, a sense that involved contributing to the strengthening of values of universal human dignity, freedom, and respect for the individual, as well as, not just the individual, but the community, the beloved community. They didn't use that term, but I'll use that Martin Luther King and Protestant theological term generally. And since then, I've maintained some contact with some of those people. The ground has just changed. The Putin machine, and it is that, it's a dictatorship. It's no longer a kind of coalition of parties, those who say, oh, it's the oligarchs and Putin. No, the oligarchs really are so thoroughly subordinate to Putin's draconian role and his network of largely I'm sounding very kind of paranoid, but anyway, KGB activists. They've changed the landscape. So this ability that many of the Christian Orthodox had imagined that they could participate in this national dialogue and move, if you will, the country towards values that were more democratic because infused with a lively sense of Christian dignity, that's not come to pass. And so I don't think we should blame that on the Christian Orthodox. Christian Orthodoxy, like Christianity around the world, is highly varied, and I caught a glimpse of it in Russia at times when it was hoping to, and I think was making a major and positive contribution. But politics can be very, very tough, and few countries have experienced a closing down of those more inclusive religious values and religious authorities than has Russia. It's a very, very sad story.